You miserable son of a bitch. I gave you my heart. I gave you my soul. I gave you my body, and you just threw me aside like I was some piece of garbage.
Yeah, my bad.
The real reason why these actors left. For 12 seasons, one house on a fictional stretch of Malibu Beach played host to America's most dysfunctional family. A jingle-writing bachelor, his uptight brother, and a kid caught in the middle turned into one of the most watched sitcoms in television history. But the way it ended wasn't a hug, a wedding, or a fade to black. It was a piano, a literal 1,000-pound grand piano dropped from the sky, crushing a man who looked exactly like the actor who had once been the highest-paid star on television, an actor who, by the time the finale aired, hadn't set foot on that set in 4 years. To understand why the creators of one of CBS's biggest hits chose to end their own show with what looked like a joke at a real person's expense, you have to go back to the beginning, because the story of how 2.5 Men ended is really the story of 3 men who left the show for 3 completely different reasons, and none of them left quietly. When Chuck Lorre and Lee Aronson first sketched out the idea in the early 2000s, the show wasn't supposed to be about a hard-drinking womanizer at all. Early pitches were built around a more delicate premise: a single father, an out-gay brother, and a son caught between 2 very different households. Network executives at CBS worried the setup was too risky for a mainstream Monday night audience, and the concept was reshaped into something safer on paper: a carefree jingle writer, his repressed, recently divorced chiropractor brother, and the brother's young son, all crammed into a beach house that was never meant to hold 3 men who couldn't be more different. The pitch was unusual enough that CBS nearly walked away from it before a single scene was shot. Sitcoms are expensive, but this one carried a price tag that made network accountants nervous, and there were real conversations inside the network about pulling the plug before the pilot even filmed. Lorre fought to keep it alive, trimming budgets where he could, and leaning on the cast to accept modest early deals in exchange for a shot at something bigger down the line. It worked. The show got its green light, a title was settled on after several rejected options, and in the fall of 2003, 2.5 Men quietly premiered without much fanfare. Nobody involved expected what happened next. Casting Charlie Harper wasn't simple. Other actors were considered for the role before Charlie Sheen signed on, and reports at the time suggested Sheen wasn't eager to commit to a weekly television schedule after years of working primarily in film. Once he did sign, though, something clicked that nobody could have fully predicted. Sheen didn't just play a charming, irresponsible bachelor, he seemed to embody one. Audiences couldn't always tell where the character ended and the actor began, and that blurred line became the show's secret weapon. Ratings climbed steadily through the first several seasons. Critics who initially dismissed the show as formulaic found themselves eating their words, and by the middle of the decade, 2.5 Men had become appointment television, regularly pulling in well over 10 million viewers a week and holding one of the most valuable advertising slots on the network. By 2010, that popularity had turned Sheen into the highest-paid actor on television, commanding a salary that dwarfed nearly everyone else in the medium. But success on that scale came with a cost that had nothing to do with money. Sheen's personal life had been chaotic for years. Struggles with substance abuse dating back to the 1990s, a highly publicized domestic violence arrest in the final days of 2009, stretches of rehab that never seemed to fully take. The show's producers and the network had absorbed those headlines before, treating them as the unfortunate but manageable cost of keeping their biggest star in front of the camera. What happened at the start of 2011 was different in kind, not just degree. In January 2011, after a particularly alarming incident, production on the show was halted so Sheen could seek treatment. Rather than using the break to quietly recover out of the public eye, Sheen went in the opposite direction. He gave a series of radio and television interviews that became instant pop culture events for all the wrong reasons: rambling, defiant, often bizarre monologues in which he described himself in terms that sounded pulled from a comic book. He talked about having tiger blood, claimed a kind of invincibility, and aimed increasingly personal insults at Chuck Lorre, the man who had built the show around him. What might have been dismissed as a private crisis instead became a public spectacle, replayed endlessly on entertainment news, and picked apart line by line online. A new social media account he opened during this period gained followers at a pace that set records at the time, less because people admired what he was saying, and more because nobody could look away. For the studio and the network, the calculation that had kept Sheen employed through years of off-camera turmoil finally broke down. In early March 2011, Warner Brothers terminated his contract, effectively firing him from the show that had made him famous. The decision wasn't just about one bad month. It reflected the studio's judgment that the behavior had become too erratic and too public to manage, and that continuing to build a hit show around him was no longer sustainable, financially or otherwise. It was an enormous risk. Sheen wasn't just the lead actor for millions of viewers, he was the show. Canceling the remaining episodes of the season and severing ties with a star still generating enormous ratings was the kind of decision studios rarely make voluntarily, and it left roughly 200 crew members suddenly out of work as the season's remaining episodes were scrapped. Sheen didn't go quietly. Within days of his firing, he filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers and Chuck Lorre personally, arguing that the studio had no legal grounds to terminate him and seeking an enormous sum in damages. The case became a legal tug-of-war over where the dispute would even be resolved. Sheen's team wanted a public jury trial, while Warner Brothers pointed to his contract's arbitration clause. The studio won that argument, and the case moved out of the public courtroom and into private arbitration. Months later, in the fall of 2011, the two sides reached a confidential settlement. Neither party revealed the exact terms, though the general shape of the deal, a substantial upfront payment plus a continuing share of the show's lucrative rerun profits, was reported at the time as a way for both sides to walk away from a fight that had already done enough damage to reputations on both ends. With its top-billed star gone, and a hit show suddenly without its centerpiece, CBS and Warner Brothers faced a genuine crisis. A show built entirely around one actor's persona doesn't easily survive that actor's departure, and the clock was ticking toward the network's annual upfront presentation to advertisers, the event where CBS would need to convince Madison Avenue that Two and a Half Men still had a future. Early talks with another well-known leading man reportedly fell apart at the last minute over creative differences, leaving the studio scrambling with almost no time to spare. The solution came together quickly, and somewhat unexpectedly. Ashton Kutcher, known at the time primarily for younger skewing comedies, Kutcher wasn't the obvious replacement for a character built around jaded, cynical bachelorhood, and some in the industry openly questioned whether his fan base would carry over to a show whose audience skewed considerably older. But Chuck Lorre backed the decision, and the deal closed just in time for CBS to unveil it before advertisers. Kutcher signed on for a season's worth of episodes, at a rate far below what Sheen had commanded, still an enormous salary by any normal standard, just a fraction of what the show had been paying its previous star. The writers handled the transition with a mix of dark comedy and closure. Kutcher's debut episode opened with Charlie Harper's funeral, revealing that the character had died after being struck by a train in Paris, a fittingly absurd exit for a man whose life had always run on chaos. The premiere drew a massive audience, roughly double the show's typical numbers, driven largely by curiosity about how the show would function without the man who defined it for 8 seasons. Kutcher's character, tech billionaire Walden Schmidt, was written as almost a mirror opposite of Charlie, wealthy and attractive, yes, but emotionally raw, recently divorced, and far more vulnerable than the character he replaced. The show found a new rhythm by flipping its internal dynamic. Alan Harper, long the butt of every joke, became something like a mentor figure to his awkward new roommate. It wasn't the show it had been, and everyone involved seemed to understand that. But it kept running, and for 4 more seasons it did. While the Sheen saga played out in headlines, a second departure was unfolding far more quietly and, in its own way, just as consequentially. Angus T. Jones had joined the show as a young child actor and grown up almost entirely on that soundstage, becoming one of the most recognizable kid actors on television by his early teens. But as Jones moved through his late teens, something shifted. The character of Jake Harper, dim, aimless, mostly there for comic relief, had been retooled as Walden took on much of the show's innocent outsider role, and Jones's screen time shrank accordingly. That alone might have simply been a natural fade for a growing cast member. What made his exit different was what he said on his way out. In 2012, Jones appeared in a video produced by a religious organization, and in that video, publicly denounced the very show that had made him famous, calling it filth, and urging viewers to stop watching. He explained that continuing to appear on the show felt increasingly at odds with a faith he had recently and seriously embraced, describing a kind of internal conflict between the person he wanted to be and the character he was being paid to play. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some praised him for speaking honestly about a crisis of conscience most actors would never admit to publicly. Others in the industry viewed it as an ungrateful attack on the show and colleagues that had built his career. Jones apologized the following day for how his comments had landed, particularly toward his castmates and crew, but he notably did not walk back his underlying criticism of the show's content. The fallout strained his relationships with people he'd worked alongside for nearly a decade. By the following year, CBS confirmed Jones would no longer appear as a series regular, and he was absent from the show's final season entirely except for a brief, poignant return in the series finale, where Jake Harper reappeared as a grown, unexpectedly successful adult, having quietly built wealth off money his uncle had once given him. Off camera, Jones stepped almost entirely away from acting, enrolling at the University of Colorado Boulder to study environmental science and pursue interests far removed from Hollywood. By the time Chuck Lorre and his writing team sat down to plan the series finale in late 2014, they were closing out a show that had survived the departure of its original lead actor, weathered a very public falling out with its breakout child star, and somehow kept running for 12 seasons despite both. The finale needed to acknowledge all of that history without becoming a clip show or a straightforward sentimental send-off. And Lorre, who had absorbed years of public insults from Sheen, chose an ending that read less like a farewell and more like a wink at the entire saga. The production kept the finale's contents unusually secretive. Scripts were distributed piecemeal, guest performers were only given the pages relevant to their scenes, and even members of the regular cast weren't told everything in advance. Speculation online ran wild in the weeks before the broadcast. Rumors swirled that Sheen himself might make a surprise cameo, fueled partly by cryptic, contradictory comments from Sheen himself on social media in the days leading up to the air date. Whether he was trolling the audience or genuinely uncertain about his own involvement was never entirely clear, and the ambiguity only fed the hype further. When the finale aired in February 2015, 13.5 million viewers tuned in, a massive number for a show in its final, diminished season. The moment everyone remembers came near the very end. A man resembling Charlie Harper appears outside the familiar beach house and rings the doorbell. Before the door even opens, a grand piano falls from above and crushes him instantly. The scene lasts only a matter of seconds. Then the camera pulls back to reveal Chuck Lorre himself, sitting nearby in a director's chair, looking directly into the lens. He utters one word, winning the exact phrase Sheen had turned into a viral punchline during his 2011 breakdown. A second piano falls. It crushes Lorre too. It was by any reading a joke at Sheen's expense, the show's creator taking one last very public shot at the man who had spent years publicly tearing him down, then immediately turning the joke on himself, as if to say the whole business had been absurd from every angle. Reaction was split almost immediately. Some viewers and critics found it clever, a fittingly irreverent way to close out a show that had never taken itself too seriously. Others called it mean-spirited, an unnecessarily petty way for a multi-millionaire producer to settle a years-old score using the platform of a series finale watched by millions. Whatever the verdict, it worked as television. The scene became an instant talking point, dissected on entertainment shows and social media for days afterward, cementing Lorre's reputation as a producer unafraid to have the last word, even at his own expense. None of the 3 men at the center of this story left the show and simply vanished, and their paths afterward tell you almost as much about the show's legacy as the finale itself. Charlie Sheen tried to rebuild almost immediately, headlining a new FX comedy that ran for 2 seasons, but never came close to recapturing his earlier success. In 2015, he revealed publicly that he was HIV positive, a disclosure that added another layer of scrutiny and difficulty to an already turbulent decade. He has spoken more candidly in interviews since then about the mistakes of that period, acknowledging in retrospect that his salary demands and public behavior in 2010 and 2011 were part of a broader unraveling rather than isolated incidents. In the years since, he's made smaller returns to television, including a notable guest appearance on a Chuck Lorre-produced series, a small but symbolic sign that the two men found some way to move past their public feud, even if the wounds never fully closed. Jon Cryer, who spent all 12 seasons as the show's steady moral center, quietly became one of the more respected comedic actors of his generation, earning Emmy recognition for the role and later branching into more dramatic work before eventually returning to lead his own sitcom. Angus T. Jones stayed almost entirely out of the spotlight for years, focusing on his education and personal life rather than acting, before making occasional low-key appearances that suggested a far more private, deliberate relationship with fame than he'd had as a child star. Ashton Kutcher, meanwhile, used the show as one chapter in an increasingly diverse career, moving into producing, headlining other series after 2.5 Men ended, and building a second, well-known career as a technology investor. Given how much cultural real estate 2.5 Men still occupies, it remains one of the most rerun sitcoms on American television. The idea of a reboot has come up periodically in interviews with the cast and crew. It has never gone anywhere, and the reasons are less about legal hurdles than about the practical reality of what the show actually was. Cryer has said in interviews that he'd be hesitant to work with Sheen again, even while wishing him well personally, a sentiment that reflects just how much strain the show's later years put on relationships that once looked unbreakable on screen. Lorre, for his part, has continued working with Sheen in smaller capacities since the finale, but has never signaled real interest in resurrecting the show itself. There's also a simpler, less dramatic explanation. The show's humor built heavily around one character's unapologetic womanizing and excess reflects a very different cultural moment than the one audiences live in now, and reviving that tone wholesale would be a much harder sell today than it was in 2003. Add to that the cast's scattered, largely fulfilled career paths since the finale, and the economics of reviving an expensive, star-driven multi-camera sitcom in a streaming-dominated market. And the picture becomes clear. 2.5 Men ended the way it did, with 2 falling pianos and one enormous inside joke, because that was really the only way it could have ended. A show built around one man's real-life chaos couldn't have closed any other way, and maybe that's exactly why, more than a decade later, people are still talking about it.